For over a century, a strip of land barely larger than the state of New Jersey has become one of the most enduring epicenters of conflict in modern human history. The eastern Mediterranean coast, known to some as the Holy Land, to others simply as Palestine, has seen empires rise and fall, armies march and retreat, and millions of lives caught in a cycle of hope, exile, and violence. It is a land where history itself seems to linger in the soil, where every stone has been touched by centuries of conquest, faith, and resistance. This is the story of Israel and Palestine, a tale of promises made and broken, of wars waged and lives uprooted, of identities formed and contested, and above all, of people striving for a place to call home. Long before the modern names of Israel or Palestine were etched into maps, this land was a crossroads of civilizations. Its valleys, deserts, and coastlines have witnessed the march of pharaohs, the sweep of Assyrian and Babylonian armies, the presence of Greek settlers and Roman legions, and the spiritual footsteps of prophets and pilgrims. For Jews, it was the promised land, the cradle of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the soil sanctified in scripture and myth. For Christians, it was the land of Jesus, the birthplace of a faith that would spread across continents. For Muslims, it became the revered location of Al-Aqsa and the third holiest site in Islam. Each epoch layered upon the last, creating a tapestry of sacred history intertwined with human struggle. Yet beneath these shared reverence and coexistence, seeds of future contention were quietly sown. By the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire absorbed the region, ruling it as part of the Levantine provinces for 4 centuries. Under Ottoman administration, Palestine was a mosaic of towns, villages, and nomadic communities. Its population was predominantly Arab, a mixture of Muslims, Christians, and Jews who lived in relative harmony, though social hierarchies and land ownership systems created friction. The Ottomans ruled through a combination of local notables, tribal leaders, and bureaucrats from Istanbul, leaving enough autonomy to local communities to govern their daily lives. But as empires tend to do, Ottoman authority was strongest in the cities and along the coasts, weaker in the hills and deserts, where loyalties were as much to kinship networks as to distant sultans. The balance of coexistence was delicate, and while overt conflict was rare, the stage was being set for a collision of national aspirations that would erupt in the centuries to come. The modern conflict began to take shape in the late 19th century, driven by a combination of European anti-Semitism and rising nationalist ideologies across the globe. In Eastern Europe, pogroms and systemic discrimination pushed Jewish communities to search for a homeland where they could live free from persecution. In 1897, the First Zionist Congress convened in Basel, Switzerland, under the leadership of Theodor Herzl, advocating for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Herzl's vision was both practical and symbolic, a safe refuge for Jews facing the rising tide of modern anti-Semitism, and a revival of historical ties to the land of their ancestors. Jewish settlers, known as Halutzim, began to migrate to Palestine, buying land from absentee landlords, draining swamps, and building agricultural communes. These early settlements laid the foundation for the modern infrastructure of what would become Israel. But their arrival was also seen by local Palestinian Arabs as a growing encroachment on their ancestral lands. At the same time, Palestinian Arab nationalism was awakening. Influenced by the broader currents of Arab reform and resistance to European colonial expansion, Palestinians began to view themselves not just as subjects of the Ottoman Empire, but as members of a distinct national community. They resisted the influx of foreign settlers, fearing that the demographic and economic shifts threatened their livelihoods and cultural heritage. The tension between Jewish immigrants and Arab residents simmered throughout the early 20th century, occasionally erupting into riots and confrontations, foreshadowing the larger conflicts to come. By the outbreak of World War I, the small towns and fields of Palestine were already charged with competing visions of sovereignty, identity, and belonging. World War I would prove to be a turning point, shattering the old empires and introducing new powers into the region. The British, seeking allies in their struggle against the Ottomans, made conflicting promises to Jews. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 expressed support for a national home in Palestine. To Arabs, British emissaries promised independence in return for support against Ottoman rule. These overlapping assurances set the stage for a century of contested expectations, a legacy of mistrust that endures to this day. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire left Palestine under British control, formally sanctioned by the League of Nations as a mandate. British administrators struggled to balance the growing demands of Jewish settlers and Palestinian Arabs, often responding to unrest with heavy-handed measures that only deepened resentment. The interwar period witnessed waves of immigration, both voluntary and forced, as Jews fleeing persecution in Europe arrived in increasing numbers. Palestinian Arabs resisted these changes, organizing revolts in 1920, 1929, and during the large-scale Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939. British troops clashed with insurgents, and both sides engaged in political maneuvering and violent reprisal. The world began to see Palestine not as a quiet backwater of the Ottoman Empire, but as a crucible where the modern dynamics of nationalism, colonialism, and conflict collided. World War II would further escalate these pressures. The Holocaust exposed the catastrophic consequences of European anti-Semitism, galvanizing international support for a Jewish homeland. Survivors sought refuge in Palestine, often facing restrictions imposed by the British authorities, who feared alienating the Arab population. The tension escalated into armed confrontations between Jewish paramilitary groups, Palestinian Arabs, and British forces. By 1947, Britain, unable to maintain control or mediate the conflicting claims, referred the issue to the United Nations, setting the stage for a decisive moment in modern history. The UN's Partition plan proposed dividing Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under international administration. Jews accepted the plan, seeing it as a stepping stone towards sovereignty, while Arabs rejected it as an unjust allocation of land. When Israel declared independence on May 14, 1948, neighboring Arab states invaded, triggering the First Arab-Israeli War. By the end of the conflict, Israel controlled more territory than envisioned under the UN plan, and some 700,000 Palestinians had been displaced or forced into exile, an event Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe. Refugee camps sprouted in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Gaza, and the reverberations of these events continue to shape the conflict today. As the dust settled, the stage was set for decades of tension, intermittent conflict, and failed peace initiatives. Armistice lines were drawn, yet the fundamental questions of sovereignty, identity, and belonging remained unresolved. Over the next half-century, wars, uprisings, and negotiations would repeatedly alter borders, policies, and lives. The rise of Palestinian resistance movements, the emergence of new Israeli governments, and the shifting policies of global powers all contributed to the complex tapestry of this conflict. The story of Israel and Palestine is not merely a story of politics and territory. It is a human story. It is the story of families uprooted, generations growing up in refugee camps, and ordinary people living under occupation or in fear of war. It is a story of hope and despair, of resilience and heartbreak, where each side carries the weight of memory, history, and identity. To understand this conflict, one must look beyond headlines and sound bites to the deeper currents of history that have shaped the land and its people. This is more than a tale of two nations. It is a tale of humanity grappling with identity, belonging, and the consequences of history itself. From ancient kingdoms to modern states, from Ottoman villages to urban centers under mandate and siege, from promises of refuge to the reality of exile, the land of Israel and Palestine tells a story of endurance, struggle, and the unyielding pursuit of home. Long before the modern names of Israel or Palestine were ever written on a map, this land was already a stage upon which the currents of history flowed relentlessly. Nestled between the Mediterranean Sea and the deserts of the Levant, its valleys, hills, and plains were traversed by traders, conquerors, pilgrims, and prophets alike. The land itself seems to hold memory, a witness to the rise and fall of empires, the sweep of armies, and the footsteps of generations who fought, worshipped, and built civilizations here. The history of Palestine stretches back thousands of years into the Bronze and Iron Ages. It was a crossroads for the great civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean. By the first millennium BCE, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah had emerged, establishing the first significant political and cultural footprints of the Jewish people in the region. Jerusalem, Hebron, and other ancient cities became centers of religion, governance, and identity. These early kingdoms laid the foundations for the deep spiritual connection that Jews would maintain with the land for millennia, even after the destruction of the First and Second Temples. During this period, the region was never static. It faced repeated invasions, from the Assyrians to the Babylonians, and later the Persians, each conquest reshaping local society, governance, and cultural practices. These invasions left behind complex legacies, diaspora communities, cultural intermingling, and political fragmentation. Yet the idea of a homeland persisted in the collective memory of the people, a dream of return that would echo through generations. By the time the Roman Empire extended its reach into Palestine in the 1st century BCE, the land had become a mosaic of cultures, languages, and religions. The Romans brought roads, aqueducts, and urban planning, transforming towns like Jerusalem, Caesarea, and Jericho into bustling centers of trade and administration. Yet Roman rule was often harsh, marked by taxation, military presence, and occasional suppression of local revolts. The destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE and the subsequent dispersal of Jewish communities became a defining moment, a rupture that scattered people and reinforced the spiritual significance of the land. The Byzantine period that followed brought Christianity as the dominant religion of the state, while Judaism and other local faiths continued to persist. Christian holy sites proliferated, attracting pilgrims from across the empire. Monasteries, churches, and towns flourished, and the land became a spiritual magnet. For centuries, Jews lived under restrictive conditions, while Christians gained social and political influence. Yet, despite religious hierarchies, local Arabs, both Christian and Muslim, maintained agricultural and mercantile livelihoods, sustaining continuity in the land's human geography. The 7th century CE brought a seismic shift. Muslim armies swept across the Levant, incorporating Palestine into the rapidly expanding Islamic caliphates. Under the Umayyads, Abbasids, and later Fatimids, Palestine became an integral part of the Muslim world. Arabic replaced Greek and Latin as the lingua franca. Islamic institutions were established, and cities like Jerusalem became central not only politically but spiritually, with the construction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, sacred sites that remain crucial today. Despite the change in political authority, the land retained its multicultural character. Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived in villages and towns, cultivating olives, grapes, and grains, trading along coastal and inland routes, and maintaining their religious and social practices. The ebb and flow of empires, the arrival of crusaders, and intermittent local uprisings created a constant tension, but also a continuity of human life that would endure until the modern era. By the early 16th century, the Ottoman Empire absorbed Palestine, integrating it into the vast imperial network that stretched from the Arabian deserts to the Balkans. Ottoman rule was marked by a mix of central authority and local autonomy. District governors, local notables, and tribal leaders administered daily life, collected taxes, and maintained order. For ordinary villagers and urban dwellers, this meant a degree of stability, but it also meant navigating complex hierarchies of power and allegiance. Palestine under the Ottomans remained a mosaic. Muslims formed the majority, with significant Christian and Jewish minorities concentrated in cities such as Jerusalem, Hebron, and Safed. Communities were organized around families, clans, and religious institutions, and land tenure systems dictated who could cultivate, own, or transfer property. While intercommunal conflict was not unknown, daily life often involved coexistence. Marketplaces, mosques, synagogues, and churches stood side by side, and agricultural practices created interdependence among different communities. Yet, the Ottomans' influence was never uniform. Coastal cities and trade routes thrived under imperial protection, while hinterlands experienced neglect, banditry, and tribal autonomy. Infrastructure, roads, irrigation, and administrative systems were uneven, creating pockets of prosperity and zones of hardship. Political authority was distant in Istanbul, leaving room for local tensions, particularly as migration patterns, economic pressures, and religious movements began to change the demographics. By the late 19th century, global forces began to intrude upon Palestine in ways that would dramatically alter its social and political landscape. European interest in the Holy Land, motivated by religious, strategic, and colonial ambitions, intensified. Missionary activity, archaeological expeditions, and travel narratives painted Palestine as both exotic and contested. Meanwhile, technological advancements in railroads, telegraphs, and printing connected distant regions and ideas, including those of nationalism and identity. The seeds of the modern conflict can be traced to this period. Jewish migration from Europe introduced new agricultural techniques, urban planning concepts, and political ideas. Jewish settlers established colonies with European financing and organizational methods, which inadvertently altered local economies and land ownership patterns. Palestinian Arabs, witnessing these changes, began to develop a sense of national consciousness. They identified not only with the land they cultivated, but also with a collective identity under threat. This emerging consciousness, fueled by Ottoman decline and the encroachment of foreign settlers, would later crystallize into organized political resistance. By the dawn of the 20th century, Palestine was no longer merely a land of empires, prophets, and trade routes. It had become a land where history, religion, culture, and identity intersected, where ancient grievances and new ambitions coexisted uneasily. Communities had survived centuries of conquest and adaptation, yet the pressures of modernity, nationalism, migration, and colonial interests created a fragile equilibrium, ready to shatter. By the late 19th century, Europe was a continent in turmoil. Industrialization had transformed economies. Urban centers swelled with populations, and nationalism surged across empires. For Jewish communities scattered across Europe, the promises of emancipation and inclusion often clashed with a persistent and violent undercurrent of anti-Semitism. Pogroms in Eastern Europe, discriminatory laws, and deep-seated prejudice created a sense of precarity that pervaded daily life. In this atmosphere, the idea of a Jewish homeland moved from spiritual aspiration to urgent political necessity. It was during this tumultuous period that Zionism emerged, not merely as a religious ideal, but as a nationalist and political movement. Theodor Herzl, an Austro-Hungarian journalist and intellectual, became its most prominent early advocate. Witnessing the rise of modern anti-Semitism and the notorious Dreyfus Affair in France, a case where a Jewish army officer was falsely accused of treason, Herzl came to believe that Jews could never be fully secure in Europe. In 1896, he published Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, articulating a vision of a sovereign Jewish nation in Palestine, where Jews could live free from persecution, develop their culture, and reclaim a historical homeland. In 1897, Herzl convened the First Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, formalizing the movement and establishing the World Zionist Organization. Delegates from across Europe debated not only the necessity of a Jewish state, but also the practical means to achieve it: land purchase, settlement, and diplomatic engagement with imperial powers. The movement was diverse. Some advocated immediate settlement in Palestine. Others looked at alternative locations in Africa or South America, while the majority saw Palestine, the land of their ancestors, as the only viable option. This ideological diversity reflected the complexity of Jewish life in the diaspora, where survival, history, and modernity were in constant negotiation. The first wave of migration, known as the First Aliyah, 1882 to 1903, saw small groups of Jews, primarily from Eastern Europe and Yemen, settle in Palestine. They established agricultural communities, or moshavot, focusing on farming and cooperative living. These settlements, financed by philanthropic organizations like the Jewish Colonial Trust and the Baron Edmund de Rothschild, introduced modern farming techniques, including irrigation, new crops, and communal labor. While modest in number, only a few thousand, these pioneers laid the foundation for future settlements and infrastructure that would later support larger waves of immigration. The arrival of Jewish settlers brought both hope and tension. Palestinian Arabs, who had cultivated the land for generations under Ottoman rule, viewed the new settlements with suspicion. Land purchases by foreign Jews sometimes resulted in the displacement of local tenant farmers, sowing resentment and anxiety. While initial interactions were limited, the growing presence of settlers began to alter the social and economic landscape of rural Palestine. Market dynamics shifted, new labor practices emerged, and the Ottoman authorities had to navigate an increasingly complex patchwork of local interests and foreign ambitions. The Second Aliyah, 1904 to 1914, followed, driven in part by worsening pogroms and anti-Jewish violence in Eastern Europe. This wave brought more ideologically motivated settlers, many influenced by socialist and nationalist ideas. They founded kibbutzim, collective farms that emphasized communal ownership and egalitarian principles. Figures like David Ben-Gurion, who would later become Israel's first prime minister, emerged during this period, blending pragmatism with ideological commitment. These settlers also became politically active, organizing labor unions, schools, and defense groups, creating the early institutional structures of the future Jewish state. While Jewish settlers worked to establish footholds, Palestinian Arabs were developing their own national consciousness. Influenced by Arab reformist movements and rising regional awareness, they began to articulate a sense of Palestinian identity tied to the land. Local leaders, religious scholars, and urban elites expressed concern over foreign settlement and land acquisition. Ottoman authorities, tasked with maintaining order, often struggled to mediate between the communities. Conflicts over land, water, and labor became more common, setting the stage for clashes that would intensify under the British Mandate. The late Ottoman period also witnessed the rise of political societies and newspapers that advocated for Palestinian interests. Figures like Mufti Khalil al-Sakakini and other local leaders began to document the economic and cultural impacts of Jewish immigration. These early critiques reflected not only fears of land loss, but also concerns about social change, modernization, and the influence of European ideologies. Palestinian society, long accustomed to Ottoman legal and social frameworks, found itself negotiating a new reality where foreign settlement, nationalism, and imperial interests intersected. During this period, Palestine remained under Ottoman control, organized into several administrative districts, including Jerusalem, Nablus, and Acre. Ottoman officials managed land registration, taxation, and civil administration, but authority was uneven. Many rural areas were effectively self-governed by local clans and village elders. This decentralized governance created both opportunities and tensions. Jewish settlers could acquire land with relative autonomy, while Palestinian communities often relied on customary law and communal authority. European powers were increasingly interested in the region, both for strategic reasons and because of the growing significance of the Zionist movement. Britain, France, and Germany established consulates, funded archaeological and religious missions, and cultivated relationships with local leaders. These interactions introduced international dynamics into local disputes, creating a complex web of influence that would later shape colonial mandates, partition plans, and post-World War conflicts. By the eve of World War I, Palestine was poised at a historical inflection point. The arrival of Jewish settlers, the rise of Palestinian nationalism, and the looming collapse of the Ottoman Empire created a volatile mix. The land that had once absorbed the tides of empires and faiths now faced a conflict rooted in modern political ideologies, nationalism, and identity. Early disputes over land, labor, and governance foreshadowed the decades of struggle that would follow under British rule and into the 20th century. This era demonstrates that the Israel-Palestine conflict is not merely a modern phenomenon. It is the culmination of centuries of history, migration, and changing identities. The foundations laid in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Jewish aspirations for a homeland, Palestinian fears of displacement, Ottoman administrative policies, and European involvement shaped the narratives, grievances, and political realities that continue to reverberate today. The emergence of the Zionist movement marked a decisive shift in the history of Palestine. It transformed the land from a quiet, multi-ethnic Ottoman province into a contested space where competing nationalisms began to clash. The first waves of Jewish settlers established not only physical settlements, but also ideological and political frameworks that would endure for generations. Simultaneously, Palestinian Arabs, responding to these changes, developed a sense of national consciousness and resistance that would define their political struggle. By the outbreak of World War I, Palestine was no longer merely a territory of the Ottoman Empire. It had become a land at the crossroads of global forces, ideologies, and aspirations. The seeds of modern conflict had been sown not in the heat of battle, but in the everyday acts of migration, settlement, resistance, and community building. Understanding this era is essential to grasping why the 20th century would bring unprecedented upheaval, displacement, and wars to this ancient land. By the early decades of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire, once the sprawling custodian of the Middle East, was showing unmistakable signs of decay. Administrative inefficiency, economic stagnation, and military defeats had weakened its control over distant provinces, and Palestine was no exception. Local governance depended heavily on notables, clan leaders, and religious authorities, whose loyalties were often more to their communities than to Istanbul. As the central authority eroded, the social, economic, and political fabric of Palestine began to change in ways that would have profound consequences. The waning power of the Ottomans coincided with the rise of Arab nationalism, a movement that sought to assert Arab identity, culture, and political autonomy in the face of both imperial domination and foreign encroachment. Across the Arab world, intellectuals, journalists, and reformists began articulating ideas of self-determination and unity. They argued that Arabs shared a common language, history, and destiny, and that European interference, coupled with the decline of Ottoman authority, presented both an opportunity and a threat. The nationalist sentiment was not monolithic. It ranged from cultural revival to political agitation, but it resonated strongly in urban centers and among the educated elite in Palestine. Ottoman rule, while still nominally sovereign, had grown increasingly detached from the realities on the ground. Taxes were levied inconsistently, law enforcement relied on local authorities, and corruption was widespread. In Palestine, urban areas such as Jerusalem, Jaffa, and Haifa saw some modernization. New schools, railways, and municipal governance structures emerged. Yet rural regions experienced neglect, with local leaders exercising significant autonomy over agricultural production, taxation, and land disputes. The Ottoman legal system persisted alongside customary laws, creating a complex patchwork that was often confusing and ripe for exploitation. This administrative weakness created a vacuum that was soon filled by competing influences. European consulates, missionaries, and commercial enterprises expanded their reach, bringing capital, ideas, and political pressure. At the same time, the growing presence of Jewish settlers introduced new economic and social dynamics. The combination of Ottoman neglect, European influence, and immigration created a fertile ground for political consciousness to develop among Palestinian Arabs. Palestinian Arab identity in this period was multifaceted, rooted in history, religion, and daily life. Villagers and urban dwellers maintained ties to ancestral lands, religious institutions, and kinship networks. Merchants in Jerusalem and Jaffa connected local economies to Mediterranean trade, while farmers in the hills and valleys cultivated olives, grains, and citrus fruits, sustaining generations of livelihoods. The land was central to identity, a source of sustenance, heritage, and belonging. However, this identity was increasingly politicized by external pressures. The influx of Jewish settlers, though small in number compared to the Arab population, represented a shift in demographic and economic patterns. Land purchases sometimes displaced tenant farmers, altering traditional relationships between communities and landowners. Palestinian intellectuals and leaders began documenting these changes, warning of potential threats to Arab cultural and political dominance. Newspapers, political clubs, and social gatherings became forums for discussing Arab rights, self-governance, and the implications of foreign settlement. The turn of the 20th century also brought Europe into the picture in unprecedented ways. The Ottoman Empire, referred to as the sick man of Europe, became the target of diplomatic intrigue, military expeditions, and colonial ambitions. Britain, France, and Germany viewed the Levant not only as a strategic region, but also as a cultural and religious touchstone. British support for Zionism, alongside assurances to Arabs, created competing expectations that would later be impossible to reconcile. Palestinian society, increasingly aware of these external forces, began to articulate political demands not only for cultural preservation, but also for political representation and self-determination within, and eventually beyond, Ottoman structures. Educated Palestinian Arabs played a crucial role in articulating nationalist sentiments. Students returning from Cairo, Beirut, and Istanbul brought ideas of Arab unity, constitutional reform, and modern governance. They wrote in newspapers and pamphlets, highlighting the threats posed by foreign settlement, imperial ambitions, and social inequality. Intellectual societies were formed, debating the future of Palestine within a broader Arab context. These discussions often centered on the tension between modernization and tradition, loyalty to the Ottoman Empire versus emerging Arab nationalism, and the need to resist foreign encroachment while preserving local identity. Religious leaders also contributed to the awakening of political consciousness. Imams, muftis, and sheikhs emphasized the moral and spiritual dimensions of land, community, and governance. Religious institutions were not only centers of worship, but also venues for education and political discourse. In this context, religion and nationalism were intertwined, providing a framework for resistance against both Ottoman neglect and Jewish immigration. The demographic and economic changes introduced by Jewish settlement occasionally resulted in localized conflicts. Tensions over land, water, and labor emerged in villages and towns, particularly as Jewish communities expanded agricultural production and established urban enterprises. Palestinian Arabs feared not only economic displacement, but also cultural marginalization. Early confrontations were often sporadic, involving local disputes and community-level resistance, but they foreshadowed the larger clashes that would erupt under British administration. The Ottoman authorities attempted to manage these tensions with a combination of administrative measures and sporadic repression. Land registration laws were introduced, local councils were convened, and occasional arrests were made. However, the administration's limited reach and internal weakness meant that enforcement was inconsistent and grievances often festered. This period demonstrated how structural decline, combined with social and economic pressures, could create conditions for conflict long before the arrival of formal colonial powers. By 1914, Palestine was a land of contrasts. Cities were centers of administration, trade, and cultural exchange, while rural areas retained traditional practices and community governance. Jews had begun to establish a visible presence through settlements, schools, and agricultural enterprises. Palestinian Arabs had begun articulating a political identity, increasingly aware of the threats posed by external forces and internal transformations. The Ottoman Empire, though still officially sovereign, had lost the capacity to fully govern, leaving communities to navigate their own social, economic, and political realities. These dynamics created a tinderbox. Demographic changes, ideological awakenings, foreign interests, and imperial decline converged to make conflict increasingly likely. The stage was set not only for confrontation between Jewish settlers and Palestinian Arabs, but also for the broader reshaping of the Middle East that World War I would bring. European powers, sensing opportunity in Ottoman weakness, were already preparing to exert influence, promising land, independence, and sovereignty to whichever groups aligned with their strategic goals. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 marked the beginning of a seismic transformation for Palestine, a land that had for centuries been a quiet, multi-ethnic province under Ottoman rule. The Ottoman Empire, already weakened and overstretched, allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary, placing its territories in the crosshairs of the warring powers. The Arab inhabitants of Palestine, like those elsewhere in the Levant, found themselves caught between imperial ambition and the stirring of nationalist aspirations. Amid this chaos, the British Empire began to craft strategies that would not only reshape the Middle East, but also lay the groundwork for a century of conflict. In 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, a brief but monumental statement that would reverberate through the decades. In a letter to Lord Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour expressed the British government's support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, while stipulating that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The declaration, deceptively concise, carried immense implications. For Jews in Europe and Palestine, it represented international recognition and hope after centuries of persecution. For Palestinian Arabs, it was a signal that their centuries-old claims to the land could be subordinated to foreign promises, a harbinger of tension and resentment. The British capture of Palestine from Ottoman forces during the war transformed political realities. Military occupation quickly became civil administration, and the League of Nations formalized this arrangement after the war by granting Britain the mandate for Palestine in 1922. Britain was tasked with preparing the territory for self-governance while implementing its commitment to facilitate Jewish settlement. This dual obligation proved inherently contradictory. Encouraging Jewish immigration while maintaining the rights of the Arab majority created structural tensions that were difficult, if not impossible, to reconcile. Administrators struggled to balance imperial interests, local demands, and competing nationalist movements, and the stage was set for an era of unrest. During the 1920s, Jewish immigration continued in waves, spurred by escalating persecution in Eastern Europe and Russia. Zionist organizations purchased land legally, developed agricultural communities, and established urban infrastructure. Cities such as Tel Aviv emerged as hubs of modernity, innovation, and political organization. Simultaneously, the influx of European Jews introduced new cultural norms, economic systems, and social networks. For Palestinian Arabs, these changes were unsettling. The expansion of settlements and the legal acquisition of land, sometimes displacing tenants, fostered anxiety and resentment. Local leaders began mobilizing communities, raising concerns to British authorities, and seeking to assert political claims over the territory they had inhabited for generations. Tensions erupted into open conflict on several occasions. The 1920 Nebi Musa riots, initially a religious procession, spiraled into violent clashes between Jews and Arabs in Jerusalem, leaving scores dead and hundreds injured. The violence highlighted the fragility of the social fabric and the inability of the British authorities to maintain order. The 1921 Jaffa riots further intensified fear and mistrust, demonstrating how economic competition, demographic shifts, and nationalist agitation could ignite violence. By the mid-1930s, these incidents had coalesced into more organized resistance. Palestinian Arabs initiated the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, a widespread uprising against British rule and Jewish immigration. Strikes, boycotts, and armed attacks targeted both British authorities and Jewish communities. The revolt was a stark illustration of the growing polarization, a manifestation of the competing visions of land, identity, and sovereignty that now defined Palestine. The British response to unrest was both military and administrative. Authorities deployed troops, imposed martial law, and sought to mediate between communities through commissions and policy adjustments. The Peel Commission of 1937, for instance, recommended partitioning the land into separate Jewish and Arab states as a potential solution to irreconcilable differences. The proposal was controversial and largely rejected by Palestinian leaders, who viewed it as an unacceptable concession of their homeland to foreign settlers. Jewish leadership was divided. Some saw partition as a practical step toward statehood, while others aspired to a larger territorial claim. The proposal, though unimplemented, foreshadowed later efforts at division and international intervention. Economic and social dynamics further complicated the situation. Jewish settlements introduced modern agricultural techniques, urban planning, and industrial initiatives, creating economic opportunities and competition. Palestinian Arabs experienced both disruption and adaptation. Some benefited from new employment and markets, while others were marginalized or displaced. Cultural and educational institutions flourished, particularly among Jewish communities, but also among Palestinian Arabs who sought to modernize their schools and media. Newspapers, political clubs, and intellectual societies proliferated, becoming arenas for debate and mobilization. This period witnessed the crystallization of distinct national identities. Jewish nationalism rooted in historical claims and ideological visions, and Palestinian nationalism grounded in land, culture, and resistance to foreign encroachment. International factors exerted a significant influence as well. Europe remained deeply involved in Palestinian affairs. Zionist organizations lobbied governments, raising funds, advocating for diplomatic support, and facilitating migration. Palestinian Arabs appealed to Arab states and the emerging Arab League, seeking recognition and support for their claims. British authorities, navigating between imperial interests, Jewish lobbying, and Arab resistance, struggled to enforce policies effectively. Conflicting promises and the contradictions inherent in the mandate system created persistent instability. Administrative reforms, land regulations, and immigration quotas were often inadequate to prevent tension, leaving communities to negotiate a precarious and increasingly volatile reality. Religious dimensions played a persistent role in the unfolding dynamics. Jerusalem, Hebron, Safed, and other sacred cities remained focal points for both spiritual devotion and political contestation. The construction and expansion of synagogues, churches, and mosques reflected not only faith, but also claims to cultural and historical legitimacy. Pilgrimages, religious festivals, and the preservation of holy sites maintained continuity even as the political landscape shifted, embedding memory and identity into the land itself. These religious claims, intertwined with nationalist aspirations, added layers of complexity to a society already fraught with economic, demographic, and political pressures. By the late 1930s, Palestine had become a land defined by contradiction. Modernity and tradition existed side by side. Foreign settlers and indigenous populations coexisted uneasily, and imperial authorities attempted governance amid rising resistance. The British Mandate period revealed the impossibility of balancing competing promises, demonstrating how structural and ideological tensions could escalate into violence and political instability. The developments during this era set the foundation for the pivotal events that would follow in World War II, the Holocaust, and the eventual United Nations Partition Plan, shaping the trajectory of the Israel-Palestine conflict for decades to come. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 transformed the world and brought a level of devastation that the modern era had scarcely seen. For Europe's Jewish population, the war unleashed the full force of anti-Semitic ideology and systemic extermination. Nazi Germany, having consolidated power under Adolf Hitler, implemented policies designed not merely to marginalize Jews, but to annihilate them. Ghettos were established, property confiscated, and millions were subjected to forced labor, starvation, and mass executions. The Holocaust, the systematic genocide that claimed the lives of 6 million Jews, represented the culmination of centuries of persecution, and it left survivors utterly displaced, broken, and desperate. In the shadow of these horrors, the urgency of a Jewish homeland was no longer abstract or ideological. It became a question of survival itself. For Jews in Europe, Palestine, though distant and difficult to reach, offered the possibility of refuge, sovereignty, and a life unshackled from persecution. The British Mandate in Palestine, still governing under promises laid down after World War I, became the central stage for this unfolding crisis. Jewish organizations, including the Jewish Agency and various Zionist institutions, intensified efforts to bring refugees to Palestine. Ships laden with survivors attempted to land on the shores of Haifa, Jaffa, and other ports, often facing British restrictions and naval blockades. The British, attempting to navigate complex political pressures, had imposed strict immigration quotas, fearing unrest among Palestinian Arabs. These restrictions created a moral and political crisis. Millions of Jews faced extermination in Europe, yet their potential refuge was constrained by administrative policy and geopolitical calculation. Illegal immigration, known as Aliyah Bet, became widespread, with clandestine networks smuggling refugees past British patrols. Each ship that reached Palestine carried not only desperate lives, but also the weight of history, symbolizing the interplay of survival, ideology, and contested sovereignty. The Holocaust intensified international sympathy for the Zionist cause. Reports of mass extermination, the liberation of camps, and survivor testimonies galvanized public opinion across the world. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and word of mouth relayed the enormity of the atrocities, making the urgency of a Jewish homeland a matter of global moral concern. Political leaders, humanitarians, and ordinary citizens alike began to advocate for the expansion of Jewish immigration to Palestine. The war had exposed the failure of previous centuries' promises of safety, integration, and emancipation for European Jews. For the Zionist movement, the imperative of statehood was no longer solely about identity or historical right. It was a tangible, pressing requirement to save lives, protect culture, and secure a future for a people whose existence had been threatened with eradication. Meanwhile, Palestinian Arabs viewed the influx of Jewish refugees through a lens of fear and skepticism. For decades, they had witnessed the growth of settlements, the purchase of land by foreign organizations, and the gradual transformation of urban and rural spaces. The arrival of Holocaust survivors, often destitute and traumatized, heightened anxieties over demographics, land ownership, and political sovereignty. Palestinian leadership, both formal and informal, protested to British authorities, warning that unchecked immigration would erode their majority, disrupt local economies, and precipitate further social unrest. Riots and demonstrations became more frequent, reflecting a deepening polarization. The ethical imperative to rescue European Jews collided with the lived reality of Palestinian Arabs, creating a moral and political dilemma that would reverberate across decades. The British response to this crisis was marked by vacillation, constraint, and calculation. Administrators attempted to uphold immigration quotas while balancing promises made to Arab leaders, maintaining colonial control, and navigating international scrutiny. The White Paper of 1939, issued on the eve of the war, limited Jewish immigration to 75,000 over 5 years and stipulated that any further immigration would require Arab consent. This policy, intended to quell Palestinian unrest, became a flashpoint of tension, drawing criticism from Jewish organizations and humanitarians worldwide. Clandestine immigration continued despite restrictions, reflecting both the desperation of refugees and the determination of Zionist networks to secure a haven. British enforcement was inconsistent, sometimes turning a blind eye, at other times intercepting vessels and detaining refugees in camps. The administrative limbo highlighted the complexity of governing a land where international morality, local politics, and imperial strategy collided. The Holocaust also reshaped the political discourse surrounding Palestine on a global stage. As Allied forces liberated concentration camps in 1945, the scope of Nazi atrocities became undeniable, cementing international recognition of the existential threat faced by Jews. Political figures in the United States, Britain, and the newly forming United Nations pressed for solutions. Zionist leaders seized the moment, emphasizing both moral obligation and practical necessity, arguing that Palestine must serve as a permanent refuge and eventual sovereign state for Jews worldwide. They framed immigration as an urgent humanitarian mission, intertwining narratives of survival, historical justice, and national destiny. Meanwhile, Palestinian Arabs framed resistance to Jewish settlement as a defense of ancestral lands, sovereignty, and cultural continuity. The stage was set for an escalating conflict in which international sympathy, legal frameworks, and political expediency intersected with local realities. In Palestine, the post-war period was marked by heightened tension, sporadic violence, and accelerated settlement. Jewish communities, bolstered by survivors and immigration networks, expanded farms, urban centers, and defensive organizations. Palestinians, facing the double pressures of demographic change and political marginalization, organized demonstrations, strikes, and resistance groups. The land itself became a theater of contestation. Villages and cities, fields and orchards, were increasingly contested spaces, sites where ideology, survival, and historical memory collided. This period laid the groundwork for the post-war partition debates, establishing patterns of settlement, political organization, and intercommunal conflict that would define the struggle for decades. The intersection of the Holocaust, Zionist aspirations, and Palestinian Arab resistance revealed the impossibility of simplistic solutions. Ethical imperatives, historical claims, and demographic realities were irreconcilably entangled. Jewish refugees carried with them the trauma of genocide and the urgency of survival. Palestinian Arabs carried the memory of displacement, economic marginalization, and the fear of losing sovereignty over their ancestral land. British administrators, constrained by imperial commitments, domestic politics, and international pressure, struggled to manage the competing claims. Each decision, whether regarding immigration quotas, settlement policy, or security enforcement, had profound implications, shaping the trajectories of communities and the unfolding of history itself. By the late 1940s, the legacy of the Holocaust had irrevocably altered both the global context and the local realities of Palestine. Millions of survivors awaited resettlement. Jewish political structures in Palestine had matured and expanded. Palestinian Arabs had mobilized resistance and articulated national claims, and British control remained tenuous and contested. The cumulative pressures of demographic, political, moral, and military forces converged to create a historical moment of unprecedented significance. The world was on the cusp of decisions that would determine the fate of nations, communities, and millions of individuals, laying the foundation for the Partition Plan, the declaration of the State of Israel, and the First Arab-Israeli War. By 1947, the question of Palestine had become one of the most urgent and polarizing issues on the global stage. The British Empire, exhausted from World War II and struggling to maintain control over an increasingly volatile mandate, turned the matter over to the newly formed United Nations. The world watched as decades of demographic change, nationalist aspiration, and imperial maneuvering converged in what would become one of the defining crises of the 20th century. Palestinian Arabs had been galvanized by decades of immigration, land purchases, and perceived encroachment on their communities, while Jewish immigrants, strengthened by survivors of the Holocaust and bolstered by organized political institutions, pressed relentlessly for statehood. The British withdrawal, rather than resolving tensions, left a political vacuum and set the stage for conflict. The United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, was tasked with evaluating the situation and proposing a resolution. In 1947, after extensive investigations and hearings with both Jewish and Arab representatives, the committee recommended partitioning Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab. Jerusalem, given its religious significance to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, was to be placed under international administration. The proposal was striking in its attempt to balance competing claims, yet inherently fraught with impossibilities. Jews were offered roughly 55% of the land, despite constituting a minority of the population and owning only a fraction of the territory. Palestinian Arabs, the majority, were allocated around 45%. The allocation reflected not only demographic and geographic calculations, but also political pressure from Zionist advocacy and the moral imperative of providing a homeland for Holocaust survivors. The UN General Assembly voted on Resolution 181 in November 1947, passing it with a two-thirds majority. Jewish leaders accepted the plan, seeing it as a pathway to sovereignty and survival. Palestinian Arabs and neighboring Arab states rejected it outright, viewing it as a foreign imposition that legitimized what they saw as colonial theft of their land. The moment the resolution was announced, Palestine descended into chaos. Violence erupted in cities and villages across the Mandate. Jerusalem, Jaffa, Haifa, and Acre became arenas of brutal confrontations. Jewish militias, including the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi, organized defensive and offensive operations to secure territories designated for the Jewish state and to protect settlements from attacks. Palestinian Arabs, often less organized but equally determined, engaged in armed resistance, targeting both Jewish communities and British forces attempting to maintain order. The streets became battlefields, and civilians bore the brunt of escalating hostilities. Families were uprooted, homes burned, and entire neighborhoods abandoned in anticipation of or in response to violence. The social fabric of Palestine, fragile under decades of competing nationalist pressures, began to unravel. As December 1947 gave way to early 1948, hostilities intensified. Jewish communities fortified towns, created supply lines, and prepared for inevitable confrontation with Arab militias and invading forces. Palestinian Arabs mobilized local fighters and sought support from neighboring countries. Political fragmentation within Palestinian leadership, however, hampered coordination, while Jewish political and military organizations demonstrated increasing centralization and strategic planning. Both sides understood that the upcoming months would be decisive. The British, preparing to withdraw, limited their engagement, leaving local forces to navigate a rapidly deteriorating situation without clear oversight. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, with access to food, medical care, and basic security severely disrupted. On May 14, 1948, as the British Mandate officially ended, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel. The declaration was not merely ceremonial. It marked the culmination of decades of immigration, political organizing, and state building. Within hours, neighboring Arab states Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded, triggering the First Arab-Israeli War. The conflict, fought across cities, towns, and rural landscapes, was marked by fierce battles, strategic maneuvers, and widespread displacement. Israel's forces, though newly established, displayed remarkable cohesion, leveraging local knowledge, organizational networks, and the motivation of a population acutely aware of the stakes. Arab armies, though numerically superior in some sectors, faced logistical challenges, disunity, and underestimation of Jewish preparedness. The human cost of the 1948 war was immense. Approximately 700,000 Palestinians were forced to flee or were expelled from their homes, becoming refugees in neighboring countries and internally displaced within what remained of the Arab-designated territories. This mass exodus, known as the Nakba or catastrophe in Arabic, became a foundational trauma for Palestinian society, embedding memory, grievance, and identity into the collective consciousness. Villages were depopulated, lands abandoned or repurposed, and social networks fractured. For Jewish communities, the war represented both triumph and peril. The successful establishment of a sovereign state was accompanied by casualties, destruction, and the immense challenge of integrating diverse immigrant populations into a functional national framework. The international response was complex and often contradictory. The United Nations attempted to mediate ceasefires and establish armistice agreements, yet enforcement was limited and local realities often outpaced diplomatic efforts. Western powers, many grappling with post-war reconstruction and the emerging Cold War, offered varying degrees of support, recognition, and caution. Arab states, frustrated by the loss of Palestine and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, sought both military solutions and political advocacy at international forums. The 1948 war did not resolve the fundamental disputes over land, sovereignty, and identity. Rather, it entrenched divisions, created new borders, and institutionalized the refugee crisis that would shape Middle Eastern politics for decades. Territorially, Israel expanded beyond the boundaries allocated in the UN Partition Plan, consolidating control over significant portions of territory designated for the Arab state. The war established the Green Line, a de facto boundary separating Israel from the West Bank, which fell under Jordanian control, and the Gaza Strip, administered by Egypt. These territorial shifts set the stage for future conflicts, occupation, and negotiations. Palestinian society, dispersed across refugee camps in Lebanon, Jordan, Gaza, and elsewhere, faced the dual challenge of survival and political organization. Leaders of the Palestinian community, often in exile, began to develop the political, military, and social structures that would later become central to the national movement. The 1948 war also marked the beginning of a pattern that would repeat across the decades: cycles of military confrontation, displacement, and diplomatic intervention. The experience of 1947 to 1949 demonstrated the interplay of local agency, international law, imperial legacies, and geopolitical maneuvering. It revealed the limitations of partition as a solution imposed from outside, the volatility of nationalist aspirations in a contested space, and the human toll of political transformation. The narratives of triumph, survival, catastrophe, and dispossession became embedded in collective memory, influencing political rhetoric, cultural expression, and subsequent generations' understanding of justice and identity. In the aftermath, Israel faced the monumental task of nation-building. Integrating Jewish immigrants from Europe and the Middle East required housing, employment, and social cohesion, all amid ongoing regional hostility. Palestinian refugees, in contrast, confronted statelessness, poverty, and the struggle to maintain cultural and familial continuity in exile. International relief organizations, Arab states, and local community structures attempted to provide aid, but the sheer scale of displacement made comprehensive solutions elusive. The events of 1947 to 1949, therefore, were not isolated military or political phenomena. They were social, cultural, and humanitarian crises with enduring implications for both communities. The unresolved questions from this period, sovereignty, borders, refugees, and access to Jerusalem, would become central to future negotiations, wars, and uprisings. The 1948 war did not mark an end, but a beginning. The foundation of the Israeli state, the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem, and the institutionalization of regional antagonism. The experiences of this period shaped the strategies, identities, and political consciousness of both sides, embedding historical memory into the fabric of national narratives and local consciousness. By the close of 1949, the landscape of Palestine had been irrevocably altered. The armistice agreements signed between Israel and its neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, established boundaries that would be known as the Green Line, a demarcation that, though not internationally recognized as permanent, defined the immediate post-war geography. Israel consolidated its territory far beyond what had been allotted under the United Nations Partition Plan, gaining strategic depth and control over urban centers, fertile plains, and critical water resources. The West Bank came under Jordanian administration, while the Gaza Strip was placed under Egyptian control. Jerusalem remained divided, with Israel controlling the western sector and Jordan the eastern sector, including the Old City. The ceasefires, while halting large-scale military operations, did little to resolve the fundamental grievances of Palestinians, many of whom had become refugees overnight. Communities that had lived for centuries on ancestral lands found themselves exiled, scattered across camps in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Gaza, their property appropriated or left abandoned. For these displaced populations, the armistice lines were not merely political boundaries, but barriers to return, symbols of loss, and loci of enduring anger and frustration. The years following the armistice were marked by persistent tension, sporadic violence, and the slow crystallization of Palestinian national identity. Refugee camps across the region became centers of political mobilization and social organization. In Jordan, camps like Jerash and Bakaweh were overcrowded, impoverished, and dependent on international relief, yet they became incubators of nationalist consciousness. In Lebanon, Palestinian communities faced discrimination and precarious conditions but maintained strong social networks, schools, and political institutions. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, was established in 1949 to provide humanitarian assistance, yet the agency's mandate, while addressing immediate survival needs, could not resolve the underlying political crisis. Displacement, deprivation, and uncertainty forged a collective memory and identity among Palestinians that would endure for generations, intertwining loss with a narrative of resistance and historical grievance. Israel, meanwhile, faced the monumental task of nation-building amidst regional hostility. The new state absorbed waves of immigrants from Europe and the Middle East, including survivors of the Holocaust and Jews fleeing persecution in Arab countries. The integration of diverse communities required the rapid development of infrastructure, housing, employment, and social services. Urban centers expanded, agricultural settlements proliferated, and defense networks were consolidated to prevent further incursions. Political institutions, shaped by the pre-state Zionist organizations, evolved into formal governmental structures under the leadership of figures such as David Ben-Gurion. The nascent state's military, the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, institutionalized the paramilitary structures that had emerged during the Mandate period, creating a disciplined and centralized force capable of both defensive and offensive operations. Security concerns were paramount, given the ongoing hostility along borders and the potential for guerrilla infiltration from neighboring territories. Amidst this tense equilibrium, cross-border raids, reprisals, and guerrilla attacks became a recurring feature of the landscape. Palestinian Fedayeen irregular fighters, often organized by local or regional political groups, carried out raids into Israeli territory, targeting settlements, military outposts, and infrastructure. These incursions were sometimes retaliatory, sometimes opportunistic, and frequently escalated into cycles of violence and counter-violence. Israeli military responses were swift and often disproportionate, aiming to deter further attacks, secure borders, and establish psychological dominance. Civilians on both sides endured the consequences. Villages were razed, farmland destroyed, and families traumatized. This period entrenched a pattern of insecurity, perpetuating cycles of retaliation and shaping military doctrine, civilian preparedness, and political rhetoric for decades to come. The political landscape of the region was further complicated by the strategic interests of external powers. The United States, the Soviet Union, and European nations maintained varying degrees of engagement, offering diplomatic recognition, economic aid, and military support. Israel sought alliances to strengthen its security and international legitimacy, navigating the complexities of Cold War geopolitics. Arab states, each with distinct political priorities and internal challenges, struggled to present a united front, and their interventions were often inconsistent or fragmented. The lack of a coherent regional strategy on the Palestinian question allowed Israel to consolidate its positions and influence. While Palestinian refugees remained politically marginalized, their claims deferred in the international arena. Within the Palestinian community, new forms of political organization emerged. Leaders in exile began to coordinate efforts through emerging nationalist groups, including the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, which would later formalize as a central political and military entity. These organizations articulated a vision of Palestinian self-determination, mobilized communities across borders, and sought international support for the recognition of Palestinian rights. Grassroots networks within refugee camps fostered education, political awareness, and social cohesion, preparing the population for a future struggle that extended beyond immediate survival. The interplay between exiled leadership and local activism created a layered political landscape in which strategies, priorities, and alliances were continuously negotiated, contested, and redefined. Economically and socially, the armistice period was characterized by disparity and adaptation. Israel invested heavily in agricultural development, industrial expansion, and urban infrastructure, often leveraging state planning, international aid, and private investment. Palestinian communities in Jordan, Lebanon, and Gaza faced restricted economic opportunities, relying heavily on informal labor, agriculture, and remittances from relatives abroad. Social services, education, and healthcare in refugee camps were minimal and inconsistent, perpetuating cycles of poverty and marginalization. This economic disparity contributed to resentment and provided fertile ground for political mobilization and militancy. The contrast between burgeoning Israeli cities and the impoverished conditions of refugee camps highlighted the unequal distribution of opportunity, resources, and political power, further entrenching the divisions that defined the conflict. Culturally and psychologically, the experiences of displacement and militarization shaped narratives on both sides. For Palestinians, the Nakba became central to collective memory, a symbol of injustice and loss that informed political activism, literature, and oral history. Israeli society, forged in the crucible of survival, immigration, and warfare, emphasized resilience, state building, and security consciousness. Educational curricula, media, and public discourse reflected these historical experiences, shaping generational perceptions of identity, legitimacy, and threat. The events of 1949 to 1967 thus created not only territorial and political realities, but also enduring cognitive frameworks in which history, memory, and ideology were inseparable from daily life and policy decisions. By the early 1960s, tensions remained unresolved, and both sides anticipated that the status quo was temporary. Israel continued to expand settlements and consolidate infrastructure, while Palestinian groups, frustrated by political marginalization and exile, increasingly considered armed struggle as a means of reclaiming their homeland. The region's political dynamics were further influenced by pan-Arab nationalism, championed by leaders such as Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, who advocated for Arab unity and resistance to Israeli statehood. These broader currents of nationalism and geopolitical ambition intersected with local grievances, creating a volatile environment in which small incidents could escalate into regional crises. The armistice period, often mistaken as a time of calm, was in reality a simmering prelude to the seismic conflicts that would erupt in 1967 and beyond. Throughout these years, Jerusalem remained a focal point of tension, division, and symbolism. The city's eastern sector, including the Old City, was under Jordanian control, and access to holy sites was tightly regulated. For Jews, the Western Wall was accessible but limited. For Muslims, the Haram al-Sharif remained under Jordanian administration. Religious, historical, and national claims intertwined, ensuring that Jerusalem was more than a political objective. It was a repository of collective memory, spiritual identity, and emotional significance. Control over the city was not merely about land. It was about history, legitimacy, and the moral weight of narrative. These dynamics foreshadowed future crises, in which the struggle for Jerusalem would continue to catalyze international attention, local tension, and violent confrontation. The period from 1949 to 1967, therefore, was defined by a tenuous equilibrium. Borders were drawn, refugees displaced, and state structures consolidated, yet fundamental disputes remained unresolved. Militarized vigilance, demographic shifts, and political organization set the stage for the next phase of confrontation. Both Palestinians and Israelis lived under a reality in which the consequences of past wars dictated present behavior and shaped expectations for the future. The foundations of prolonged conflict were embedded not only in territory and governance, but also in identity, memory, and experience. This era, often overlooked, was a crucible in which strategies, institutions, and consciousness were forged, preparing both communities for the dramatic upheavals that would follow in the 1967 Six-Day War. By June 1967, the Middle East had reached a precarious tipping point. The years following the 1949 armistice had done little to resolve the fundamental disputes over territory, sovereignty, and identity. Palestinian refugees continued to live in camps across the region, their lives constrained by displacement, economic hardship, and political marginalization. Israel, consolidating its borders and state institutions, had become increasingly confident in its military capabilities, yet remained surrounded by Arab nations committed, at least rhetorically, to its destruction. The tension was both local and regional, driven by unresolved grievances, pan-Arab nationalism, Cold War geopolitics, and the enduring legacies of previous wars. The Six-Day War, which erupted in early June, was the explosive result of these converging pressures, a conflict whose outcomes would redefine the map, the politics, and the consciousness of the Middle East. The immediate lead-up to war was marked by escalating provocations, military mobilizations, and inflammatory rhetoric. Egypt, under the leadership of Gamal Abdel Nasser, closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, a move Israel considered a casus belli. Syria engaged in artillery exchanges along the northern border, while Jordan signed a mutual defense pact with Egypt, aligning the region's military forces. Arab nations framed these actions as part of a broader struggle to resist Israeli occupation and protect Palestinian rights. Yet internal dynamics, including political rivalry, domestic pressure, and the desire to assert regional leadership, played an equally significant role. Israel, perceiving an existential threat, faced a calculus in which preemptive action appeared increasingly necessary. Military planning intensified, with the Israeli Defense Forces preparing for rapid, coordinated strikes against multiple fronts. On June 5, 1967, Israel launched preemptive airstrikes against Egyptian airfields, effectively crippling the Egyptian Air Force in hours. This decisive action demonstrated both strategic foresight and meticulous planning, catching Arab forces off guard and establishing air superiority for the remainder of the conflict. Within days, ground operations unfolded simultaneously along multiple fronts: the Sinai Peninsula against Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem against Jordan, and the Golan Heights against Syria. The rapidity of Israeli advances stunned the international community. In less than a week, Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula, and Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. The territorial changes were extraordinary in scale and speed, altering not only maps, but also the geopolitical landscape, refugee populations, and the very nature of the conflict itself. The capture of East Jerusalem carried profound symbolic and practical implications. For the first time in modern history, Israel controlled the Old City, including sacred sites revered by Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike. The Western Wall, the Dome of the Rock, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre now fell under Israeli administration, sparking intense religious, political, and emotional reactions. The unification of Jerusalem under Israeli control was celebrated domestically as a historic and spiritual triumph, yet it immediately became a flashpoint for international tension and Palestinian grievance. Religious identity, historical memory, and nationalist claims intertwined in the city, making it a microcosm of the broader conflict, contested, sacred, and impossible to resolve through military victory alone. The war's aftermath had immediate and far-reaching consequences for Palestinian society. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, who had been living under Jordanian and Egyptian administration, respectively, now found themselves under Israeli military occupation. Daily life was transformed. New laws, curfews, restrictions on movement, and the presence of Israeli military personnel imposed an unfamiliar and often oppressive reality. Land ownership, housing, and agriculture were subjected to new regulations, while Palestinian political and social institutions faced suppression or co-optation. Refugee populations swelled as some Palestinians fled advancing Israeli forces, adding to the humanitarian challenges already present from previous displacements. The occupation created a structural inequality that would define Israeli-Palestinian relations for decades, embedding power disparities, resentment, and cycles of resistance into the social fabric. International responses were mixed and often inconsistent. The United Nations passed Resolution 242, calling for Israel's withdrawal from the occupied territories and the recognition of the sovereignty of all states in the region. Yet the resolution's language, particularly the phrasing territories rather than all territories, left room for interpretation and dispute, becoming a point of contention in subsequent negotiations. Global powers, embroiled in Cold War politics, viewed the conflict through strategic lenses. The United States increasingly aligned with Israel as a bulwark against Soviet influence, while the Soviet Union maintained ties with Arab states. Diplomatic efforts to restore peace and negotiate withdrawal faced significant obstacles, as local actors were unwilling to compromise on issues central to identity, security, and national aspiration. The rapidity of Israel's territorial gains, coupled with the international community's inability to enforce meaningful constraints, reshaped regional calculations and emboldened both sides in ways that would have lasting consequences. The occupation introduced profound and enduring changes in governance, economy, and daily life in the West Bank and Gaza. The Israeli military administration imposed laws governing movement, property, taxation, and security. Checkpoints, permits, and curfews became routine, fundamentally altering Palestinian mobility and autonomy. Land expropriation, settlement expansion, and infrastructure development favored Israeli strategic and civilian priorities, often at the expense of Palestinian livelihoods and traditional land use. Economically, Palestinian markets were increasingly integrated into Israeli systems, creating dependence and constraining independent development. Socially, communities faced psychological trauma, diminished autonomy, and growing frustration over perceived injustice. The occupation, while administratively effective, planted the seeds of political mobilization, resistance movements, and the eventual emergence of organized uprisings. The strategic significance of the territories acquired in 1967 cannot be overstated. The West Bank, with its fertile plains, aquifers, and historical cities, offered both economic and symbolic importance. Gaza, densely populated and geographically constrained, became a focal point for future Palestinian resistance. The Golan Heights provided military advantage and oversight of northern Israel, while the Sinai Peninsula offered strategic depth and resources until its eventual return in the Camp David Accords. These territorial gains, achieved in less than a week, altered Israel's security calculus and demographic realities, yet they simultaneously intensified the complexity of governing a population with distinct national aspirations. The capture of land created not only physical occupation, but also the necessity of managing an entrenched conflict that combined historical grievances, religious significance, and international scrutiny. Palestinian political consciousness underwent a significant transformation in response to the 1967 war. The occupation crystallized a sense of urgency and injustice, fostering the growth of organized political and military structures. Groups such as Fatah, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, and other factions gained prominence, articulating ideologies centered on resistance, self-determination, and the reclamation of territory. Refugee camps, already politicized from previous decades, became sites of mobilization, education, and recruitment. The emergence of these organizations signaled a new phase in the conflict, moving from localized insurgency and sporadic raids to more coordinated, transnational, and ideologically driven resistance. Palestinian identity, shaped by exile, occupation, and collective memory, became inseparable from political struggle. The 1967 war also reshaped Israeli society, politics, and military doctrine. The swift victory reinforced narratives of national resilience, military superiority, and historical destiny. Security became central to domestic policy, with military service, intelligence operations, and territorial defense embedded into the collective consciousness. Settlement policy emerged as a tool of both security and ideology, with debates over the legal, religious, and strategic implications of occupying the West Bank and Gaza shaping political discourse. The experience of the war, combined with the responsibilities of occupation, created complex moral, political, and practical dilemmas for Israeli leadership, civil society, and international relations. The Six-Day War, despite its brevity, left a legacy of transformation that would define the next decades of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Borders had been redrawn, populations placed under military control, and national narratives reshaped. International law, diplomacy, and moral arguments were tested against the realities of occupation and survival. Palestinian displacement, trauma, and mobilization intensified, while Israeli territorial gains and military prowess cemented both strategic advantage and international debate. The conflict's rapid resolution belied the long-term consequences. The war had set in motion cycles of resistance, settlement, negotiation, and violence that continue to reverberate across the Middle East, embedding historical memory into land, identity, and politics in ways that no military victory alone could resolve. The years following the 1967 Six-Day War were a period of dramatic geopolitical recalibration, punctuated by fleeting moments of diplomacy, recurring violence, and the steady intensification of the Israeli-Palestinian struggle. Israel, flush with the spoils of rapid victory, faced the complex task of integrating occupied territories while navigating international scrutiny and regional hostility. Palestinian society, meanwhile, confronted the stark reality of life under occupation, with social, economic, and political structures increasingly constrained by military governance. Across the Middle East, broader dynamics of pan-Arab nationalism, Cold War alignment, and regional rivalries intersected with the local struggle, creating a volatile environment in which the possibility of lasting peace seemed as distant as ever. It was within this context that the 1970s and 1980s unfolded decades of negotiation, protest, uprising, and incremental shifts that would leave an indelible mark on the conflict. The 1970s opened with a period of reassessment following the 1967 war. Arab states, humiliated by their rapid defeat and the loss of territory, sought to reclaim strategic leverage while addressing domestic pressures. Egypt, under President Anwar Sadat, gradually shifted from the rhetoric of total confrontation to a more pragmatic approach, recognizing the futility of repeated conventional wars against a militarily superior Israel. Sadat's overtures culminated in secret negotiations with Israel, mediated by the United States, leading to the historic Camp David Accords of 1978. The agreements resulted in a formal peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, the first between Israel and an Arab state. Sinai was returned to Egypt, and both nations recognized one another diplomatically. The Accords demonstrated that diplomacy, however fraught, could produce tangible results, yet they also exposed the limitations of negotiation in resolving the deeper Palestinian question. Egypt's decision to negotiate independently was perceived by other Arab states and Palestinian groups as a betrayal, highlighting the fragmentation and complexity of regional politics. During this same period, the Palestinian national movement evolved in response to both occupation and regional diplomacy. The Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, emerged as the preeminent representative of Palestinian aspirations, consolidating various factions under a central command and establishing political, military, and diplomatic wings. Operating from bases in Lebanon, Jordan, and other territories, the PLO conducted guerrilla operations, cross-border raids, and high-profile international campaigns to advance the cause of Palestinian self-determination. These operations were met with Israeli military countermeasures, including targeted raids, intelligence operations, and coordinated defensive measures designed to neutralize threats. The cycle of action and reaction entrenched animosity while simultaneously drawing global attention to the Palestinian struggle, framing it as both a local conflict and an international humanitarian and political issue. Internally, Palestinian society under occupation faced profound economic and social challenges. In the West Bank and Gaza, Israeli administrative control imposed curfews, restrictions on movement, and military law that shaped everyday life. Access to employment, education, and healthcare was regulated, and property rights were frequently contested or restricted. Settlement expansion, particularly in strategically significant areas, exacerbated tensions, displacing local populations and altering the geographic and demographic landscape. For Palestinian youth, growing up under occupation meant constant exposure to checkpoints, military patrols, and societal marginalization. The accumulation of grievances, combined with economic hardship and political disempowerment, created a fertile environment for popular mobilization and, eventually, mass uprising. By the mid-1980s, frustration within Palestinian society reached a tipping point. Daily realities under occupation, including curfews, home demolitions, land confiscation, and restricted access to basic resources, created widespread resentment. Social structures in towns, villages, and refugee camps adapted. Informal networks emerged to support education and community cohesion, and political awareness deepened. Against this backdrop, the First Intifada, which began in December 1987, erupted as a mass uprising against Israeli military control. Unlike previous armed confrontations led primarily by organized militias, the Intifada was characterized by broad-based civilian participation. Stone-throwing demonstrations, boycotts of Israeli products, strikes, and nonviolent resistance coexisted with violent confrontations. The uprising reflected both the desperation and resilience of Palestinian society, revealing a population willing to confront systemic oppression despite overwhelming military power and limited international leverage. The Israeli response to the First Intifada was both immediate and severe. The Israel Defense Forces employed a combination of arrests, curfews, and patrols to quell demonstrations, while using targeted military force against perceived threats. Civilian infrastructure, including schools, health facilities, and marketplaces, became entangled in the conflict, and casualties mounted on both sides. International media coverage brought unprecedented attention to the conflict, portraying images of young Palestinians confronting armed soldiers and civilians navigating checkpoints and curfews. The visibility of the uprising heightened global awareness and sympathy for Palestinian grievances, while simultaneously hardening Israeli domestic perceptions of security and the necessity of military control. The Intifada became a defining moment, signaling that occupation could not merely be managed through administration and defense. Popular resistance had reshaped the dynamics of control, legitimacy, and political discourse. Amidst the unrest, early efforts at peace and negotiation persisted. Various rounds of diplomacy, often mediated by the United States and other international actors, sought to establish frameworks for coexistence, partial autonomy, and the reduction of violence. The recognition of the PLO as a legitimate political actor in certain forums began to shift the parameters of negotiation. Palestinian political and social structures gained legitimacy, and the notion of a Palestinian state, at least in principle, became embedded in international discourse. These developments underscored the dual nature of the conflict. Military control and civilian resistance were inseparable from political recognition and international legitimacy. The conflict had become multidimensional, involving not only soldiers and militants but also diplomats, aid organizations, journalists, and global opinion. Settlement expansion in the occupied territories, particularly in the West Bank, added another layer of complexity to the 1970s and 1980s landscape. Israeli settlements, justified by a combination of strategic security considerations, religious ideology, and demographic calculations, created friction with local populations. Each settlement became both a physical and symbolic assertion of Israeli presence, challenging the territorial integrity and aspirations of Palestinian society. The settlements were often fortified and supported by military infrastructure, reflecting the inseparability of civilian and defense considerations. For Palestinians, settlement expansion represented dispossession and the creeping normalization of occupation, galvanizing political mobilization and reinforcing the narrative of resistance. Settlement policy, alongside military occupation, legal frameworks, and international diplomacy, became a central component of the ongoing conflict. The First Intifada also reshaped generational perceptions of the conflict. Palestinian youth, many born under occupation, developed political consciousness through experience, education, and participation in daily resistance. Communities cultivated informal leadership structures, neighborhood committees, and civil initiatives to maintain order and support collective action. The uprising demonstrated the capacity of grassroots mobilization to challenge a militarily dominant power, altering assumptions about asymmetrical conflict and occupation. For Israel, the Intifada forced a reassessment of strategy, policy, and international image, revealing that military control alone could not secure lasting compliance or stability. The cycle of action, repression, and adaptation underscored the intricate interplay of local agency, structural power, and the symbolic dimensions of conflict. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, regional politics continued to influence the trajectory of the conflict. The Cold War injected external interests, with the United States increasingly serving as Israel's strategic ally and arms supplier, while the Soviet Union maintained relationships with Egypt, Syria, and other Arab states. Pan-Arab rhetoric, championed by leaders such as Nasser and his successors, emphasized solidarity with the Palestinian cause, yet practical support was often limited by domestic constraints, inter-Arab rivalry, and shifting alliances. This complex geopolitical environment created both opportunities and constraints for Palestinian and Israeli actors, shaping the timing, intensity, and nature of political, military, and social strategies. Economically, the occupation and resistance generated both hardship and adaptation. Israel invested in infrastructure, agriculture, and urban development in the occupied territories, integrating aspects of the economy into the Israeli system while constraining autonomous Palestinian growth. Palestinians responded with informal economic networks, mutual support structures, and adaptive strategies to sustain livelihoods amidst restrictions. Refugee camps remained centers of poverty, but also hubs of political mobilization and social innovation, illustrating the interplay between economic hardship and political resilience. Economic control and access became tools of governance, leverage, and resistance, influencing daily life and long-term political calculations. The 1970s and 1980s, therefore, were decades of paradox and transformation. Moments of diplomacy, such as the Camp David Accords, demonstrated the possibility of negotiated peace, yet structural inequalities, occupation, and unresolved grievances ensured that conflict persisted. Popular uprisings, including the First Intifada, revealed the limits of military control and the enduring vitality of Palestinian society. Settlement expansion, economic integration, and administrative measures reflected Israel's consolidation of territory and power, yet also created friction that would fuel subsequent cycles of resistance. Across these decades, the conflict evolved from one defined by wars between states to a multidimensional struggle encompassing civilians, militants, political actors, and international institutions, laying the groundwork for the complex and protracted struggle that continues into the 21st century. The 1990s opened a new chapter in the Israel-Palestine conflict, a period suffused with cautious optimism, tentative diplomacy, and the persistent shadow of violence. The decades of occupation, guerrilla attacks, and cycles of reprisal had created an environment of mutual mistrust, yet the international and regional context shifted in ways that allowed for dialogue previously considered impossible. The end of the Cold War reduced superpower rivalry in the region. Global attention increasingly favored negotiation, and both Israelis and Palestinians faced internal pressures that made the status quo unsustainable. The Oslo Accords, signed in 1993 and 1995, emerged from this confluence of factors, representing a historic attempt to forge a path toward coexistence and partial self-determination. Yet, even as hopes rose, the foundations of the conflict, unresolved territorial disputes, contested sovereignty, and deep-seated historical grievances, remained largely intact, lurking beneath the surface. The Oslo process began in secrecy, mediated by Norway, and involved back-channel negotiations between the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, and the Israeli government. For decades, the PLO had been labeled a terrorist organization by Israel and much of the international community, yet its centrality to the Palestinian national movement was undeniable. Recognizing the PLO as a legitimate negotiating partner was both a pragmatic and symbolic shift, acknowledging the reality of the Palestinian organization, influence, and resilience. The Accords established mutual recognition. The PLO recognized Israel's right to exist in peace and security, while Israel recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. This mutual acknowledgement represented a profound departure from prior decades, in which denial, delegitimization, and violence had dominated interactions. The agreements created a framework for the phased implementation of Palestinian self-rule in portions of the West Bank and Gaza. The establishment of the Palestinian Authority, PA, provided a limited governance structure, responsible for civil administration, policing, and infrastructure in designated areas. The intention was incremental: build confidence, establish local governance, and gradually expand autonomy while negotiating final status issues, including Jerusalem, borders, settlements, refugees, and security arrangements. In Israel, the Accords were celebrated as a pragmatic solution that could secure peace and recognition while maintaining strategic advantage. Yet optimism coexisted with skepticism. Many Israelis feared that concessions would compromise security, while Palestinians questioned whether negotiations would translate into meaningful sovereignty and justice. The early years following Oslo were marked by both promise and volatility. Cooperation in civil matters, security coordination, and economic development signaled the potential for coexistence, yet underlying tensions persisted. settlement construction in the West Bank continued, sometimes openly sanctioned and other times tacitly ignored, fueling Palestinian frustration. Political violence, often carried out by extremist factions opposed to the peace process on both sides, threatened to derail progress. High-profile assassinations, bombings, and attacks punctuated the period, demonstrating that a veneer of diplomacy could not erase deeply rooted hostility or historical grievances. Public opinion fluctuated, reflecting disillusionment, hope, fear, and resentment, illustrating the challenges of implementing peace amid decades of mistrust and trauma. By 2000, the fragile optimism had begun to erode. Efforts to negotiate final status agreements stalled, and contentious issues, particularly the status of Jerusalem, the right of return for Palestinian refugees, and the expansion of Israeli settlements, remained unresolved. In September 2000, the failure of the Camp David summit, coupled with provocative visits and inflammatory rhetoric, ignited the Second Intifada, a widespread and violent uprising that far surpassed the earlier First Intifada in intensity and casualties. The uprising was characterized by armed confrontations, suicide bombings, military incursions, and widespread social disruption. Israeli forces employed tanks, helicopters, and extensive ground operations to suppress the uprising, while Palestinian militants operated from urban areas, refugee camps, and rural enclaves, creating a cycle of violence that blurred the boundaries between combatants and civilians. The Second Intifada transformed daily life across Israel and the occupied territories. Palestinian civilians faced curfews, checkpoints, and military operations that restricted mobility, limited access to essential services, and inflicted widespread economic damage. Schools, hospitals, and marketplaces were often disrupted or destroyed, exacerbating the humanitarian impact of the conflict. Israeli civilians endured attacks in public spaces, transportation networks, and residential areas, generating fear, trauma, and political pressure for decisive security measures. The intensity and proximity of violence created an environment in which normal life was persistently under threat, reinforcing cycles of retaliation, mistrust, and radicalization on both sides. Internationally, the Second Intifada complicated diplomatic efforts and reshaped perceptions of the conflict. The images of urban warfare, civilian casualties, and retaliatory operations dominated global media, framing the narrative in ways that influenced public opinion, policy decisions, and humanitarian intervention. While some states and organizations continued to advocate for a negotiated solution based on Oslo principles, others emphasized security imperatives, counterterrorism, and political isolation of perceived aggressors. The conflict's visibility highlighted the limitations of international mechanisms, revealing the difficulties of mediating in situations where historical grievances, territorial disputes, and local agency intersect with global political dynamics. The socio-political impact of the Second Intifada was profound. Palestinian society experienced internal fragmentation as political factions vied for influence, legitimacy, and control over resources. Hamas, which combined political activity with militant operations, gained prominence in Gaza and among segments of the West Bank population dissatisfied with the PLO and the perceived failures of the Oslo process. Fatah, historically dominant in Palestinian politics, faced challenges to its authority and credibility. These internal divisions complicated governance, social cohesion, and strategic decision-making, highlighting the difficulty of representing a population fractured by geography, occupation, and political ideology. On the Israeli side, the conflict reinforced hardline political tendencies, intensified security measures, and influenced electoral politics, embedding fear, vigilance, and strategic calculation into domestic and military policy. Economically, the Second Intifada inflicted severe disruption. Palestinian territories faced the destruction of infrastructure, restricted access to markets, and curtailed mobility, leading to unemployment, poverty, and dependence on humanitarian aid. Israeli economic sectors, particularly in border regions and urban centers vulnerable to attacks, also suffered losses. The economic interdependence between Israel and the Palestinian territories, which had developed during the Oslo period, was strained by violence, undermining prospects for cooperative development and reinforcing grievances. The intertwining of economic hardship with political frustration amplified the intensity of the conflict, demonstrating that material conditions and social structures were inseparable from the dynamics of occupation and resistance. Culturally and psychologically, the period reshaped collective consciousness. Generations of Palestinians who had lived under occupation, experienced exile, or endured cycles of violence developed political awareness, narratives of resistance, and expectations for self-determination that were deeply ingrained. Israeli society, confronted with persistent security threats, integrated trauma, fear, and survival into its national identity and policy framework. Education, media, and public discourse reflected and reinforced these experiences, shaping perceptions of legitimacy, threat, and justice for both populations. Memory, symbolism, and narrative became central tools in sustaining political legitimacy, mobilizing populations, and interpreting historical events. Efforts to mediate and resolve the conflict continued during this period, but were constrained by structural, political, and social realities. Negotiations, whether bilateral or multilateral, were hampered by violence, mutual distrust, and competing claims over Jerusalem, borders, settlements, and refugees. International actors, including the United States, European Union, and United Nations, attempted to broker solutions, provide humanitarian assistance, and facilitate dialogue. Yet their influence was limited by the agency and strategic interests of local actors. The failure to implement or sustain negotiated agreements underscored the difficulty of reconciling deeply entrenched historical grievances with pragmatic political compromise. The Oslo period and the Second Intifada thus represent a complex interplay of hope, frustration, diplomacy, and violence. They illustrate the difficulty of transitioning from decades of militarized occupation and nationalist struggle to a negotiated peace, and they reveal how cycles of conflict, displacement, and political mobilization shape both local and regional dynamics. The experiences of the 1990s and early 2000s demonstrate that even comprehensive agreements, mutual recognition, and structured governance mechanisms are insufficient to overcome the legacies of historical trauma, territorial disputes, and identity-based conflict. These decades set the stage for the persistent stalemate, ongoing settlement expansion, intermittent conflict, and fragile diplomacy that continue to define the Israel-Palestine struggle into the 21st century. The dawn of the 21st century did not herald the peace many had hoped for following the Oslo Accords. Instead, it marked the intensification and fragmentation of the Israel-Palestine conflict, transforming into a landscape of asymmetric warfare, political division, and protracted humanitarian crises. The Second Intifada had ended, leaving behind a shattered infrastructure, deep mistrust, and hardened political positions on both sides. Yet the underlying structural dynamics of occupation, territorial disputes, and contested sovereignty persisted, intensifying in new ways as demographics, technology, and geopolitics evolved. Gaza and the West Bank, once integrated under Palestinian governance structures, became increasingly distinct arenas of contestation, each shaped by the interplay of local leadership, Israeli security policy, and international involvement. In Gaza, the rise of Hamas as both a political and militant organization redefined the conflict. Emerging from the Muslim Brotherhood tradition with a platform of resistance to Israeli occupation and social welfare provision, Hamas capitalized on disillusionment with the Palestinian Authority, corruption allegations, and perceived failures of negotiation. In 2006, Hamas won a decisive electoral victory, establishing a political mandate that challenged Fatah's authority in the Oslo framework. The ensuing struggle for control between Hamas and Fatah culminated in 2007, with Hamas forcibly taking control of Gaza, effectively splitting Palestinian governance. Gaza became an enclave under Hamas rule, while the West Bank remained under the Palestinian Authority, creating parallel political realities that complicated the prospects for a unified Palestinian strategy and international negotiation. Israeli policy toward Gaza adapted to this new reality, oscillating between targeted military interventions, blockade measures, and strategic containment. Israel's objective was to neutralize the threat posed by Hamas's military capabilities, including rockets, tunnels, and guerrilla operations, while attempting to minimize direct casualties and international condemnation. The resulting pattern was cyclical: military escalation, temporary ceasefires, humanitarian crises, and reconstruction efforts. Each confrontation, whether Operation Cast Lead in 2008 to 2009, Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012, or Operation Protective Edge in 2014, left profound physical destruction, psychological trauma, and social disruption in Gaza. Homes, schools, hospitals, and infrastructure were destroyed, often in densely populated urban environments, amplifying civilian suffering and international attention. The blockade imposed by Israel and Egypt restricted movement, trade, and access to essential goods, creating economic stagnation and exacerbating humanitarian vulnerabilities. Gaza's population, increasingly young and urbanized, faced high unemployment, limited opportunities, and the pervasive normalization of conflict in daily life. The West Bank, in contrast, experienced a different set of pressures and dynamics. Israeli settlements, a continuous source of tension, expanded steadily, often justified by security, historical, or religious claims. Settlements, along with the accompanying infrastructure roads, checkpoints, and security installations, fragmented Palestinian territorial continuity, complicating the prospect of a viable, contiguous Palestinian state. The presence of Israeli military forces, combined with administrative control over movement, policing, and law enforcement, created a daily reality of restriction for Palestinians, affecting employment, education, healthcare, and social cohesion. Checkpoints and barriers limited access between towns, villages, and urban centers, reinforcing a sense of occupation and constraining economic and social development. Meanwhile, Palestinian leadership in the West Bank faced the dual challenge of asserting authority, maintaining order, and negotiating with an increasingly assertive Israeli government, all while managing internal dissent in the shadow of Hamas influence from Gaza. The 21st century also introduced new dimensions of the conflict, shaped by global media, technology, and international diplomacy. Social media and digital platforms amplified local events to global audiences in real time, creating a feedback loop in which narratives, images, and reports influenced international opinion, humanitarian intervention, and diplomatic pressure. Palestinian and Israeli actors alike leveraged media visibility to advance political objectives, mobilize support, and frame moral and historical claims. International organizations, including the United Nations, human rights groups, and non-governmental organizations, documented violations, provided aid, and advocated for solutions, yet their influence was constrained by the entrenched asymmetry of power, political fragmentation, and the intractability of core disputes. The global visibility of Gaza and the West Bank intensified both scrutiny and polarization, highlighting the broader ethical, legal, and humanitarian dimensions of the conflict. Repeated military engagements in Gaza created profound societal consequences. Physical destruction, limited access to resources, and constant insecurity reshaped urban environments and social structures. Psychological trauma, particularly among children and young adults, became widespread, influencing educational outcomes, social relationships, and political attitudes. The cyclical nature of conflict, in which reconstruction efforts were regularly disrupted by renewed hostilities, entrenched despair, and radicalization, fueling narratives of resistance and martyrdom while constraining the emergence of civil society initiatives. Humanitarian crises, exacerbated by blockades, economic stagnation, and damaged infrastructure, generated dependency on aid, constrained mobility, and limited opportunities for social and economic development, deepening the complexity of governance and political negotiation. The expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank intensified territorial and demographic pressures. Each new settlement, often accompanied by supporting infrastructure and security measures, altered the geography of control, making a contiguous Palestinian state increasingly implausible. The settlements not only affected land use and local resources, but also symbolized the entrenchment of Israeli strategic and ideological priorities. They became focal points of protest, negotiation, and violence, with confrontations between settlers, Palestinian residents, and security forces recurring across decades. Settlements, coupled with road networks and military zones, created a fragmented territorial mosaic, constraining Palestinian mobility, economic integration, and political coherence. The geographic reality on the ground reinforced perceptions of injustice, fueled political mobilization, and embedded structural inequities that persist to the present. Gaza and the West Bank also diverged politically and socially, reflecting the fragmentation of Palestinian governance. Hamas in Gaza implemented social services, education programs, and community organization alongside its military operations, consolidating local authority and political legitimacy. In the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority attempted to govern under the constraints of occupation, limited autonomy, and international oversight, often facing criticism for perceived corruption, inefficiency, and inability to advance meaningful sovereignty. The divergence in governance structures created different local realities, political cultures, and strategies of resistance, complicating internal cohesion and limiting the capacity for unified negotiation with Israel or external actors. International involvement remained a double-edged sword. Diplomatic initiatives, including the Quartet on the Middle East composed of the United Nations, United States, European Union, and Russia, sought to mediate peace, advocate for a two-state solution, and facilitate humanitarian assistance. Yet their efforts were repeatedly undermined by on-the-ground realities, settlement expansion, cycles of violence, political fragmentation, and deep-seated mistrust. Regional actors, including Egypt, Jordan, and Gulf states, navigated complex alliances and domestic considerations, sometimes supporting mediation, sometimes pursuing narrow strategic interests. The international landscape reflected both the significance of global engagement and the limitations of external influence in a conflict defined by local history, identity, and power asymmetry. Economic dynamics in Gaza and the West Bank further illustrate the structural complexity of the conflict. In Gaza, the blockade, limited infrastructure, and recurrent destruction restricted economic activity, creating high unemployment and dependency on humanitarian aid. Informal economies emerged as survival strategies, but systemic constraints limited sustainable development. In the West Bank, mobility restrictions, settlement expansion, and administrative controls shaped labor markets, trade, and agriculture, creating economic dependencies and reinforcing social stratification. Economic conditions, intertwined with political grievances and daily life under occupation, became both a driver of unrest and a lens through which Palestinians experienced and interpreted the broader conflict. The 21st century also emphasized the symbolic dimension of the conflict. Jerusalem, with its profound religious, historical, and political significance remained a central flashpoint. Contested sites, including the Haram al-Sharif/Temple Mount, were imbued with layers of identity, history, and sovereignty claims, making political compromise nearly impossible. Incidents in Jerusalem often reverberated across Gaza, the West Bank, and the broader region, catalyzing protests, violence, and international attention. The city became not only a physical locus of contention, but a symbol of the intractable intertwining of religion, history, and nationalism that defines the broader conflict. The 21st century, therefore, represents a phase in the Israel-Palestine conflict defined by fragmentation, asymmetry, and complexity. Gaza and the West Bank evolved into distinct arenas of struggle, each shaped by political leadership, occupation, resistance, and humanitarian conditions. Military operations, settlement expansion, and administrative control intersected with popular mobilization, governance challenges, and international engagement to create a multidimensional conflict. The human cost, psychological impact, and structural inequities embedded during this period deepened the cycle of grievance and resistance, making resolution ever more elusive. The contemporary landscape reflects the cumulative legacies of previous wars, political failures, and social transformations, revealing a conflict that is simultaneously territorial, ideological, humanitarian, and profoundly human. As the 21st century advances, the Israel-Palestine conflict remains unresolved, entrenched, and highly visible, both regionally and globally. Despite decades of negotiation, intermittent ceasefires, and sporadic peace initiatives, the fundamental disputes over territory, sovereignty, and identity endure. The contemporary landscape is characterized by a fragmentation of Palestinian governance, ongoing Israeli settlement expansion, humanitarian crises, and a shifting geopolitical environment that continues to shape, constrain, and complicate prospects for resolution. Jerusalem remains a focal point of contention, Gaza a site of recurring conflict, and the West Bank a patchwork of territories marked by military control, settlements, and Palestinian civil administration. These realities create a conflict that is simultaneously local and global, historical and immediate, deeply political and profoundly human. Gaza, under the control of Hamas, exemplifies the multidimensional challenges of modern conflict. The enclave's population lives under constant pressure from blockade, limited resources, and recurrent military operations, resulting in profound humanitarian consequences. Schools, hospitals, and public infrastructure remain vulnerable, and the economy is heavily constrained, with high unemployment and limited access to international markets. Periodic escalations, often triggered by rocket attacks, border incidents, or political provocations, prompt large-scale military responses by Israel, including airstrikes, ground incursions, and targeted operations. These cycles of violence devastate urban environments, create mass displacement, and generate psychological trauma, reinforcing a sense of siege and fostering narratives of resistance and survival. Despite international aid efforts and ceasefire negotiations, the structural dynamics of blockade, occupation, and political division prevent long-term recovery or sustainable governance, ensuring that Gaza remains a volatile flashpoint. The West Bank, under the administration of the Palestinian Authority, presents a different yet equally complex set of challenges. Israeli settlements continue to expand, supported by infrastructure, security measures, and legal frameworks that assert territorial control. This expansion fragments Palestinian land, limits mobility, and undermines the feasibility of a contiguous Palestinian state. Checkpoints, military zones, and barriers restrict daily life, affecting access to education, healthcare, and employment, while exacerbating tensions between residents and Israeli forces. The Palestinian Authority exercises partial governance in designated areas, yet its authority is constrained by occupation, political fragmentation, and the broader strategic calculations of Israel. Internal divisions, including rivalry with Hamas, complicate political coherence, policy implementation, and negotiation capacity. The West Bank thus exemplifies the challenges of governance under occupation, where limited autonomy coexists with structural vulnerability, economic constraints, and persistent security pressures. Jerusalem, the epicenter of religious, historical, and political significance, continues to be a flashpoint for conflict. The city is claimed as a capital by both Israel and the Palestinians, with sacred sites central to Judaism, Islam, and Christianity adding layers of symbolic and strategic importance. Contested locations, such as the Haram al-Sharif/Temple Mount, are frequently the scene of clashes, provocations, and political maneuvering, drawing local, regional, and international attention. Israeli sovereignty over East Jerusalem and the status of Palestinian residents remain highly contested. While political initiatives to designate the city as a shared capital or to partition control have repeatedly stalled or failed, Jerusalem's centrality ensures that disputes over the city reverberate across Gaza, the West Bank, and neighboring states, influencing broader regional dynamics and complicating diplomatic efforts. The broader geopolitical context further shapes the conflict. The United States continues to be Israel's principal ally, providing military support, diplomatic backing, and strategic counsel, while other global powers, including the European Union, Russia, and regional actors such as Egypt, Jordan, and Qatar, play varied roles in mediation, humanitarian aid, and political pressure. Some Arab states have moved toward normalization with Israel, as evidenced by agreements such as the Abraham Accords, while others maintain strong support for Palestinian claims, creating a fragmented and shifting regional landscape. This complex matrix of alliances, strategic interests, and competing priorities affects the calculus of both Israeli and Palestinian actors, shaping military strategy, settlement policy, political negotiation, and the timing and intensity of conflict escalation. The humanitarian situation in Gaza and the West Bank remains a central concern. In Gaza, the blockade restricts the movement of people, goods, and essential services, exacerbating poverty, unemployment, and food insecurity. Health infrastructure, already fragile, is frequently overwhelmed during military escalations, limiting access to medical care and creating long-term public health challenges. Water, electricity, and sanitation services are unreliable, further compounding the daily struggle for survival. In the West Bank, movement restrictions, land confiscation, and settlement expansion undermine economic development and social stability, creating localized humanitarian pressures even as overall conditions may be comparatively better than in Gaza. The intersection of conflict, occupation, and economic hardship ensures that humanitarian challenges are persistent, deeply intertwined with political realities, and resistant to simple solutions. The security dimension remains a constant driver of policy and perception. Israel maintains a robust military presence, intelligence apparatus, and technological surveillance network to monitor, deter, and respond to perceived threats from both Gaza and the West Bank. Palestinian armed groups, including Hamas and smaller factions, continue to develop capabilities for asymmetric warfare, utilizing tunnels, rockets, and guerrilla tactics to challenge Israeli control. Cycles of escalation, targeted strikes, and retaliatory measures have created a pattern in which military engagement is both a tool of strategy and a source of ongoing instability. Civilian populations on both sides are affected, with casualties, displacement, and trauma reinforcing narratives of fear, resistance, and legitimacy that perpetuate the conflict. Political processes aimed at resolution have largely stalled or been marginalized. Efforts to revive negotiations for a two-state solution, mediated by the United States, the United Nations, and other international actors, confront structural obstacles, settlement expansion, political fragmentation, the status of Jerusalem, the right of return for refugees, and security considerations. Internal Palestinian divisions between Hamas and Fatah further complicate unified representation, while Israeli domestic politics often prioritize security, ideological settlement support, and electoral considerations over compromise. Diplomatic initiatives, while occasionally producing temporary ceasefires or limited agreements, rarely address the underlying structural issues, creating cycles of negotiation, breakdown, and renewed violence. Demographically, the conflict continues to evolve. Population growth in Gaza and the West Bank intensifies pressure on limited resources, infrastructure, and urban spaces, while also influencing political dynamics and representation. In Israel, demographic shifts affect policy, electoral outcomes, and the social context for decision-making, particularly regarding security, settlements, and minority relations. These demographic realities intersect with territorial control, governance, and economic opportunity, shaping long-term prospects for coexistence or continued division. Population trends, combined with settlement expansion, displacement, and urbanization, contribute to a complex spatial and social landscape that challenges conventional solutions and complicates international mediation. The role of international law, humanitarian norms, and human rights frameworks remains significant yet contested. Israeli policies in the occupied territories, including settlements, military operations, and administrative control, are scrutinized through United Nations resolutions, international legal opinion, and human rights advocacy. Palestinian actions, including armed resistance and militant operations, are similarly evaluated under international norms, often creating asymmetrical narratives of victimhood, legitimacy, and accountability. Legal, ethical, and moral arguments shape global perception, media coverage, and diplomatic engagement, yet enforcement mechanisms are limited, revealing the structural imbalance between normative frameworks and the realities of power, occupation, and governance. Technology, media, and communications amplify the conflict in unprecedented ways. Social media platforms, real-time reporting, and citizen journalism bring local events to a global audience instantaneously, influencing public opinion, advocacy, and policy responses. Images and narratives of conflict, humanitarian suffering, and political protests circulate widely, shaping perceptions and political discourse far beyond the immediate region. The visibility of Gaza and the West Bank, coupled with international engagement and polarization, ensures that local actions have global repercussions, creating feedback loops in which local violence, political maneuvering, and public perception reinforce one another in complex ways. The contemporary Israel-Palestine conflict, therefore, is simultaneously an urban, rural, political, humanitarian, military, and symbolic struggle. Gaza, with its blockade and cyclical conflict, represents the acute humanitarian and military dimension, while the West Bank, with its settlements, military zones, and political fragmentation, illustrates the structural and administrative challenges of occupation. Jerusalem embodies the contested religious and symbolic terrain, while international actors, alliances, and diplomacy provide both potential leverage and persistent obstacles. The intertwining of local agency, historical grievance, global attention, and asymmetric power ensures that the conflict remains multidimensional, protracted, and resistant to conventional resolution. The 21st century also underscores the temporal dimension of the conflict. Each escalation, policy decision, or political shift interacts with the accumulated historical layers of dispossession, occupation, resistance, and negotiation. The legacy of the 1948 Nakba, the 1967 occupation, the Intifadas, the Oslo process, and subsequent conflicts continues to shape perceptions, motivations, and strategies. Collective memory, identity, and historical narrative are central to both Palestinian and Israeli political culture, informing policy, resistance, and diplomacy. The past is not merely a backdrop, but an active force shaping contemporary dynamics, reinforcing mistrust, fueling claims of legitimacy, and complicating efforts to envision a shared future. In sum, the current situation reflects the entanglement of historical grievances, structural power asymmetries, geopolitical shifts, and human resilience. Gaza, the West Bank, and Jerusalem each present unique but interconnected challenges, while internal Palestinian divisions and Israeli domestic politics further complicate prospects for peace. International involvement, humanitarian crises, demographic pressures, and media visibility reinforce the multidimensional nature of the conflict. Understanding the contemporary Israel-Palestine situation requires recognizing that it is not a static or isolated problem, but a dynamic and evolving struggle rooted in history, identity, and contested sovereignty, and perpetuated by the persistent interaction of local, regional, and global forces. The history of Israel and Palestine, viewed through the lens of time, reveals a tapestry woven with the threads of competing nationalisms, broken promises, and the human cost of prolonged conflict. It is a history defined by cycles of migration and displacement, diplomacy and betrayal, violence and uneasy truces. Across centuries, empires rose and fell over this land, yet the struggles of its people, Israelis and Palestinians alike, endure, shaped by memory, identity, and the relentless pressures of survival. Every narrative, whether Jewish or Palestinian, is layered with historical experience, trauma, aspiration, and resilience. To understand the conflict fully requires attention not only to political agreements or military campaigns, but to the lived realities, cultural legacies, and symbolic landscapes that sustain the struggle, shaping perceptions of legitimacy, justice, and belonging. The paradox of the Israel-Palestine story is that moments of optimism are invariably shadowed by the persistence of structural and psychological impediments. The Oslo Accords, Camp David negotiations, UN resolutions, and international peace initiatives illustrate the possibility of compromise, yet they also expose the fragility of trust and the depth of historical grievances. Each breakthrough is matched by setbacks, each declaration of intent by a proliferation of obstacles, blockades, militant actions, and political fragmentation. The coexistence of these dynamics underscores the conflict's complexity. It is neither linear nor reducible to simple moral narratives. Every agreement, confrontation, or escalation must be understood within a continuum shaped by history, identity, and the asymmetric distribution of power. Central to the story is the human dimension, the millions who live, resist, and endure amidst this enduring struggle. For Palestinians, displacement, refugee status, restricted movement, and economic hardship are daily realities, compounded by the psychological weight of occupation and repeated military confrontations. For Israelis, security threats, terrorism, and historical memory create a persistent sense of vulnerability, shaping political priorities, social behavior, and national identity. Both populations are affected by generational trauma, with young people growing up amid checkpoints, barriers, and conflict, internalizing experiences that influence social cohesion, political attitudes, and collective narratives. These human experiences are inseparable from the historical and political dimensions, reflecting the interplay between structure and agency, policy and lived reality. The geography of the conflict is similarly instructive, a land whose contours are as symbolic as they are strategic. Jerusalem, with its contested sacred sites, embodies historical and spiritual significance that transcends political negotiation, rendering compromise nearly impossible. Gaza, a densely populated enclave, reflects the human cost of blockade, warfare, and governance fragmentation. The West Bank, with its patchwork of settlements, checkpoints, and administrative zones, illustrates the structural asymmetry of occupation and the logistical obstacles to statehood or autonomy. Across these territories, the landscape itself becomes a record of history, a palimpsest of battles, agreements, demographic shifts, and infrastructural interventions, revealing how power, memory, and resistance are inscribed into the land. The historical continuum of violence, displacement, and negotiation has produced political cultures characterized by resilience, adaptation, and strategic calculation. Palestinian political life is defined by the tension between resistance and governance, between local needs and national aspirations. Israeli politics oscillate between security imperatives, ideological commitments, and domestic political pressures. Each society has institutionalized mechanisms to manage, respond to, and interpret the conflict, producing narratives that justify actions, mobilize populations, and legitimize claims. These narratives are reinforced through education, media, religion, and civic engagement, embedding historical memory and political ideology into social structures and everyday life. The international dimension of the conflict further complicates resolution. Global powers, regional actors, and multilateral institutions have long engaged in mediation, aid provision, and political negotiation. The United States' historical alignment with Israel, the European Union's advocacy for human rights, and a two-state solution, and the roles of neighboring Arab states all shape the possibilities and limitations of diplomacy. However, the persistent divergence between local realities and international priorities highlights the difficulty of translating external pressure into sustainable resolution. International involvement is often reactive, episodic, or constrained by competing interests, reflecting both the moral engagement and strategic calculations that shape global responses. Cultural memory and identity are central to the endurance of the conflict. Each side's historical narrative is a repository of perceived injustice, heroism, loss, and aspiration. For Palestinians, the memory of the Nakba, ongoing occupation, and struggle for self-determination underpins political mobilization and collective consciousness. For Israelis, the memory of persecution, the Holocaust, and historical claims to the land inform security policies, national identity, and territorial priorities. These intertwined narratives are more than historical records. They are active frameworks through which contemporary events are interpreted, legitimacy is claimed, and political action is justified. The persistence of these narratives ensures that history is not simply past, but actively shapes the present and constrains the future. The technological and media landscape of the 21st century amplifies these dynamics. Social media, 24-hour news cycles, and digital communication platforms make local events globally visible, intensifying scrutiny, advocacy, and polarization. Images of conflict, displacement, and military operations circulate widely, shaping international perception, influencing policy, and mobilizing support. This visibility increases both moral pressure and strategic complexity, creating a feedback loop in which local actions have immediate global ramifications. The global stage, therefore, is not merely an external observer, but an active participant in shaping the conflict's trajectory, perception, and stakes. Demographics and urbanization further complicate the historical trajectory. Population growth in Gaza and the West Bank increases pressure on infrastructure, land, and services, while Israel's demographic trends influence domestic politics, security calculations, and settlement policy. Urban areas become dense arenas of contestation, blending civilian life with strategic significance, making conflict management both politically and militarily complex. Young generations, shaped by occupation, displacement, and conflict, carry forward the legacies of trauma, identity, and historical grievance, influencing political culture, social norms, and prospects for reconciliation. These demographic realities are inextricably linked to the political, military, and humanitarian dimensions of the conflict, creating structural conditions that perpetuate tension and constrain resolution. Economically, the conflict generates stark asymmetries. Gaza's blockade and recurrent military operations inhibit trade, investment, and local enterprise, creating dependency on aid and constraining social mobility. The West Bank experiences restricted movement, limited access to resources, and fragmented economic zones, undermining development and reinforcing reliance on Israel for employment, trade, and services. Israel maintains economic stability and technological development, but domestic security expenditures and regional instability impose costs on growth and societal resources. Economic conditions are therefore both a consequence and a driver of political tension, shaping the daily experience of life, opportunity, and aspiration for all populations involved. The interplay of history, identity, power, and human experience creates a conflict resistant to simple resolution. Every military operation, political negotiation, or social movement must be understood in the context of centuries of occupation, migration, empire, and resistance. Historical grievances, cultural memory, and narratives of legitimacy are continuously activated in response to contemporary events, ensuring that the past is never fully past. The land itself, contested, sacred, and strategically significant, embodies the layered histories and ongoing struggles, reinforcing the inseparability of geography and politics in this conflict. Even amid repeated failures, moments of dialogue, ceasefire, and negotiation demonstrate the enduring human capacity for diplomacy, compromise, and hope. Civil society initiatives, grassroots movements, and international advocacy show that alternative pathways, however difficult, remain conceivable. Yet, each initiative contends with structural asymmetries, political fragmentation, and historical mistrust, highlighting that resolution is not merely a question of negotiation, but of addressing deeply embedded social, political, and historical realities. Peace, therefore, is both aspirational and contingent, requiring sustained engagement, creative diplomacy, and acknowledgement of historical complexity. The history of Israel and Palestine is ultimately a story of endurance. Empires have risen and fallen, borders have shifted, and political actors have changed, yet the human dimension persists in daily life. Survival, resistance, and aspiration continue amid the shadows of history. It is a story in which victories are often measured in incremental gains rather than absolute resolution, where suffering and resilience coexist, and where every decision resonates across generations. Understanding this history is essential not to assign blame or choose sides, but to recognize the intricate interweaving of culture, politics, geography, and human agency that sustains the conflict and shapes the possibilities for the future. The narratives of displacement, occupation, resistance, and survival reveal that both societies are shaped by historical memory as much as by contemporary events. Memory functions as both guide and constraint, informing political action, justifying claims, and maintaining collective identity, while simultaneously complicating reconciliation. Generational transmission of trauma, narratives of historical injustice, and the symbolic weight of land and sacred sites ensure that the past remains an active participant in contemporary life. The psychological, cultural, and political dimensions of memory thus play a decisive role in shaping the trajectory of conflict, the strategies of negotiation, and the prospects for coexistence. Conflict, in this sense, is not merely territorial or political, but fundamentally human. It is expressed in daily life in restrictions on movement, access to resources, security concerns, and social interactions, and in national narratives, international diplomacy, and military operations. The intersection of lived experience, structural constraints, and historical legacy makes resolution profoundly complex. Yet within this complexity exists the potential for understanding, empathy, and creative problem-solving. Recognizing the humanity, aspirations, and vulnerabilities of all parties is a prerequisite for envisioning solutions that are politically viable, socially just, and historically informed. The story of Israel and Palestine, therefore, cannot be fully captured by events alone. It is a narrative of identity, memory, and enduring struggle, in which the land is both a stage and a participant, where history is alive, and where every generation inherits the legacies of the past. It is a testament to the resilience of human societies, the power of narrative, and the profound difficulty of reconciling competing claims to home, belonging, and justice. To engage with this history is to confront the complexity of human conflict, the endurance of memory, and the enduring challenge of forging peace in a land where the past and present are inseparable.